St. Luke's Gospel includes some of the most attractive stories, conversations, and parables of Jesus, some of them found nowhere else in the Gospels. When you look at chapter 15 of St. Luke's Gospel, for example, you see that on the one hand, Luke has inherited a version of the parable of the lost sheep, for Matthew knows of it too. But then St. Luke pairs it with another of his exclusives, the parable of the lost coin, and so once again ensures that his collected stories give equal weight to a man who has lost the sheep and a woman who has lost the coin. And then Luke follows on with yet another story only he has preserved, the parable of the Prodigal Son, also known variously as the parable of the two brothers, the lost son, or the forgiving father. It's lengthy. So the gospel passage for the fourth Sunday of Lent this year begins with chapter 15, verses 1 to 3, with the tax collectors and sinners drawing near to Jesus to hear him. And he goes on, the Pharisees and the scribes murmured, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." Then the reading skips to verse 11, to this parable of the lost son, the prodigal son. For with the continuing story of Jesus' final journey to Jerusalem unfolding before us, these first three verses are there to indicate the growing hostility of the religious establishment towards Jesus, while at the same time winning the attention and gratitude of society's outcasts. So Luke describes a conversation with a Pharisee who had invited Jesus to a meal. In chapter 14, the previous chapter, Jesus had urged this man, this ruler, as St. Luke describes him, to offer his hospitality to those who could not repay it. Pharisees are now objecting to the company that Jesus is keeping, tax collectors and sinners. Luke himself will soon denigrate the Pharisees in his gospel. They love money and jeer at Jesus' teaching on its use, as he does in chapter 16. As Jesus draws nearer and nearer to Jerusalem, he will contrast the self-righteous Pharisee and the contrite tax collector in another of his parables, where they both go up to pray in the temple. The Pharisee preening himself before God, the contrite tax collector simply beating his breast, casting his eyes down and praying that the Lord will have mercy on him, a sinner. And then Jesus will then go on to bring salvation to the house of the tax collector Zacchaeus in chapter 19. In fact, it's instructive to take a look at the other two parables with which chapter 15 begins, omitted from the gospel reading for the fourth Sunday in Lent, the lost sheep and the lost coin. In the first brief parable, the shepherd has lost one sheep out of 100. You may be familiar with the kind of Victorian illustration at one time found in a children's Bible, typically showing a sweet lamb resting placidly on the usually blonde-haired shepherd's shoulders. But Jesus listeners will more probably have thought of a heavy, smelly, dirty sheep, frightened and obstinate, stuck fast in the consequences of its own error. An image which perhaps more closely represents our nature and our reaction to God's offer of rescue. Now, Jesus raises the stakes in the second brief parable. The shepherd had 100 sheep. The woman has only 10 silver coins. In a windowless house in Palestine, she needs lamp and broom for her search. This time, Luke's Jesus draws the friends and neighbors into the allegory as the angels of heaven who rejoice with God at the recovery of a single sinner. And so to the prodigal son, the parable. It's no longer a property that is lost, but a person. So Luke has put these parables together for a reason. The conflict in his narrative is growing, This young teacher who had seemed so promising is keeping company with the outcasts of society, the tax collectors and collaborators with Rome, the notorious sinners, continual breakers of the law. He actually welcomes them and seems to enjoy their company, and it's no good trying to get round it by stories about sheep and lost coins. Of course, we try to find the lost things that belong to us, but this is really too much. Jesus speaks of the angels, the heavenly host, God's nobler creation, close to his throne, rejoicing when a sinner repents, not accepting back with reproof and warnings to do better in future, but actually rejoicing. Sin was very much in the minds of those who knew Jesus in his human ministry, and it was too often the basis for self-righteousness on the part of those who thought they were free from it. If you remember, his disciples asked him about the man born blind. Did this man sin, or was it his parents? Sin and repentance are not fashionable themes today, sometimes not even in our churches. The gospel teaching is not blurred. Sin is serious, repentance is wonderful. Careful to avoid the smugness and hypocrisy of the scribes and Pharisees, let us not fall into the opposite error of thinking that sin is not all that important. The love of God is a cause for joy, but not for presumption. The story of wastrel son and forgiving father is told with all the artistry and delicacy of character study that Luke so ably brings to the telling of it. The boy returns home, young man, returns home not because he is particularly repentant, but because he is broke and hungry. The loving father keeps a perpetual watch for his possible return, even though his son had written him off with his demand for his inheritance here and now. The father runs out to meet him and cuts short the boy's no doubt carefully rehearsed speech with a welcoming embrace, a fattened calf that would feed the whole village. Nor does he ignore his elder son, but leaves his guests at the party to go out into the field and to plead with the disgruntled elder brother. My son, you are with me always, and all I have is yours. But it was only right that we should celebrate and rejoice, because your brother here was dead and has come to life. He was lost and is found. Those two short parables, paired with this third parable of the prodigal son, are an unforgettable allegory of God's love and forbearance towards us. But it is more than that. The Father is given words twice over that reveal in the Son far more than a pattern for our own restoration. This son of mine, says the Father, was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. St. Luke's characters are always somewhat like ourselves, good and bad at the same time. And as with the prodigal son, they often reflect on their situation. What shall I do now? Build new barns for my bumper harvest? Ingratiate myself with my father's debtors? Compose a pretty speech to soothe father's anger? All these examples appear in Luke's Gospel and nowhere else. What remains in this example is an unforgettable picture of the overflowing love and forgiveness of God.